Archmage is some of that new hotness. A powerful, highly build-defining support gem that dominates the theory crafting process of any build that it gets thrown into. Functionally, it adds a massive pool of lightning damage, which is oddly not top-end lightning damage, but just a flat amount, to whatever skill it supports based on the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. It then also adds a mana cost to the skill equivalent to 6% of your unreserved mana, provided that value is higher than what it would otherwise be. This functionality provides an interesting way of scaling the damage of an Archmage build, through simply scaling mana cost, providing all the base damage you could ever dream of needing. The obvious downside, however, is that a mana cost in the thousands can be somewhat cumbersome, and requires a build around in its own right. Certain skills, though, will lend themselves to this cumbersome aspect. Generally, things that require little in the way of spam casting, as casting something that costs 5,000 mana once every second is far less difficult to maintain than casting it 5 times that much. Generally speaking, skills that get a lot of uptime for minimal casting input are some of the best candidates, which is why Stormbrand is one of the most popular options. Through the use of brand recall, you can essentially skip the need to recast, thus only needing to pay the exorbitant mana cost infrequently. Cremation, though, the subject of this video, is not quite as cooperative in this regard, but still is capable of remaining active for 8 seconds baseline before duration scaling, and has good enough range on the tossed projectiles to cover boss movement or the entirety of a pack fairly well, meaning recasting is more of a necessity than Stormbrand, but still not an impossible burden by any means. So, armed with a basic overview of why Cremation, let's get into the more interesting question. How Cremation? We'll begin with the gear. To preface, nothing equipped on this character is absolutely build-defining. There are no core unique interactions that make the build possible and without which it wouldn't function, outside, arguably, of fevered mind stacking allowing mana cost scaling to reach absurd levels. That means that this build is just a few lucky Vol Orbs away from being very solo self-found viable. So I can certainly recommend it for that setting. That said, there are a number of uniques that I do consider best in slot for one reason or another. Just know that while all these are quite powerful, none of them are strictly necessary and all have viable replacements. Beginning at the top, then, we have the helmet slot, which has one of these uniques that I consider best in slot. The helmet in question is Crown of the Inward Eye, which drops from Cyrus and takes the cake here due not only to exceptional life and mana scaling, but also a hefty sum of percent increased damage coming from the Transfiguration of Mind effect, which causes increases to mana to apply to spell damage at a 30% ratio. This, as you can imagine in a build which prioritizes mana quite heavily, is a very significant chunk of damage. That said, this slot could just as easily be handled by a rare helmet if resistances are tight or budget is short. Aim for mana, life, and ideally the Cremation can place an additional Geyser helmet enchant. Absolutely best in slot is getting the Geyser enchant on a well-rolled crown, which, by the way, has a very impactful roll, so be aware of the roll on yours, but doing so can be pricey or just annoying, since not many are listed. Moving down to the amulet slot, we have another unique that is essentially best in slot. With very, very good luck and some crafting ingenuity, I believe a stronger rare amulet is probably possible than Netziri's foible, but the currency involved in creating such a beast would be so monstrous that it would be silly to do so in the face of how much power foible gives you for how cheap it is. This is another piece on which it is going to be very important to be aware of the rolls that you're purchasing, by the way. The ranges on both the maximum mana and the mana regeneration rolls are quite important, as the build wants eventually to be able to eschew a mana flask in favor of a Dying Sun, and needs to be capable of rapid regeneration of mana to compensate. Battle Rouse is a useful, moderately cheap anoint, giving you further maximum mana and another secondary source of recovery when hits do get through your block chance. And as a final note on this slot, be sure to work on catalyzing this with fertile catalysts. Toss them on as you get them if you can't afford to purchase 20 of them outright. In solo self-found, keep an eye out for temple amulets with hybrid percent increased mana and flat mana, though foible is not so uncommon that it would be unreasonable to eventually expect to see one. Many builds making use of Necromancer's block scaling and Mind over Matter will often employ a Shaper Shield with recovery of mana or life on block, as they are incredibly powerful ways to regain the mana lost from Archmage or life lost from damage. I've opted, however, to prioritize elemental mitigation on the shield slot and attempt to solve mana recovery mostly through passive regeneration, as that does not require taking hits to enable, which is a dangerous practice in many endgame encounters in hardcore. That said, were a shield to show up in my crafting that had both +2 max LE res, and recovery unblock, I would not have turned my nose up at it. This decision is simply a matter of deciding that elemental mitigation was a whole more in need of patching than mana recovery. That said, I'd recommend using elemental or chaos resistance essences or alteration orb spam to attempt to craft an item level 85 Shaper Shield base to achieve this. Ideally a hybrid armor energy shield or pure energy shield one with the highest base block you can find. Spell block, life recovery unblock, and high life or mana rolls are all very desirable alongside your +2 maximum resistances roll. For a budget option, an On's Heritage works wonders providing you have not made use of any endurance charge generation elsewhere in the build. The ring slots are both fairly simple. Ideally, you're after cerulean bases in order to push mana values that little bit further, and I'd recommend fertile catalysts on these as well. You then will want to use these as necessary to fix up resistances, stat requirements, and nab an extra couple life rolls. Nothing fancy required. If you can't quite fit in cerulean implicits as a result of resistance problems or budget problems, it won't make or break the build, don't worry. Do still look for flat mana rolls on your rings if you're able to, though. The most important thing to scale in your weapon slot is going to be things like maximum mana, lightning penetration, elemental or lightning damage gained as chaos, and % increased elemental, lightning, or spell damage. Despite Cremation being a fire skill, fire damage is not very effective for us, as the majority of our damage is lightning, due to Archmage being so powerful at providing base damage. For similar reasons, flat damage added to spells is not particularly strong, as a mana roll would outshine it both in terms of flat damage added overall due to Archmage and versatility, since mana is a defensive tool as well as an offensive one. In an Archmage build, mana is king. A bit of mana regeneration or cast speed here can go a long way as well, and importantly, you need to make sure a suffix remains open on your weapon so you can craft trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill, as this enables automation of Bone Offering, Cold Snap, and Wave of Conviction. The body armor slot is fairly versatile for this build. Cloak of Defiance is a common choice for Archmage builds, as it gives a large amount of mana, mana regeneration, and greater access to the mana pool that you've built as a defensive tool. That said, I'm wary of the lack of a life roll, as this build already makes use of a couple of uniques without one, and too low a life pool will leave us vulnerable to stuns. Alternatively, a Hunter-touched rare with effective offerings and will bring spell block closer to cap, and a Shaper-touched rare can give us the Mind Over Matter effectiveness we'd want from Cloak without denying us a life roll. You can even smush these two rolls together with an Awakener Orb if you've got quite a bit of budget to work with. A cheap, powerful option that I've gone for, however, is Shroud of the Lightless. With both % life and % mana scaling, this chess piece is incredibly efficient for Mind Over Matter, and also gives access to a 6 link worth of damage while only needing to be 5 linked. That said, any of the above options, or just a nice rare with a good life and mana roll, will all function fine. Build to suit your needs and your budget. For gloves, I've opted for a newly added unique. Alongside Delirium as a Simulacrum drop, Algor Mortis was added and is extremely powerful if you're consistently able to enable them, as Sap is one of the more powerful, obscure ailments, and 35% increased lightning damage taken is almost a 35% more multiplier in this build. Enabling them, though, is the fiddly bit, as chill generated from the corpses we summon due to Necromancer's Ascendancy effect do not, I repeat, do not count as a chilling area. This is why the build makes use of a Cold Snap socketed into the trigger weapon. The duration scaling from the Ascendancy in the area of chilled ground generated by Cold Snap ensures that anything that survives more than a couple seconds is going to be feeling the chill of Algor Mortis consistently. Bonus, these are quite cheap in Trade League, so not only is getting a well-rolled pair fairly easy, but corrupting them for elemental weakness or enfeeble on hit is rather cheap. In absence of these gloves, aim for fingerless silk gloves with life and mana, as well as res should you need it. The belt slot is fairly straightforward, and is simply a Stygian vise with, you guessed it, life, mana, and resistances. If you're crafting from scratch, I actually recommend prismatic catalysts and fossil crafting with prismatic fossils here. This tactic has proven very effective for getting extremely high resistance belts for me. Oh, and you may have expected this, but socket into the belt a jewel with life and mana, and ideally, an onslaught on kill roll. But this can be a useful place to solve lingering stat or resistance problems as well. The boots are more of the same, life, mana, resistances, but prioritize as well getting 30% movement speed at least. If you can't quite fit all of these onto the same boots as a result of budgetary concerns, then either aim to drop the mana roll here and pick up better boots later, or settle perhaps for 25% movement speed. If you get a nice pair, take the time to run Uber Lab with them and some Twice Enchanted Prophecies to get the 70% increased mana regeneration if you've cast a spell recently enchant, as it goes a very long way to being able to drop your mana flask. Speaking of flasks, the ideal setup, in my opinion, is a single instant life flask, bubbling or seething. A Rumi's concoction, focus on the spell block roll here, as any attack block roll ought to be good enough to get you to cap, especially if you've opted for the Hunter chest. A Quicksilver flask, a phasing to avoid getting mobbed and dangerous content, and a Dying Sun for coverage and projectile count, which is single target damage. As I mentioned earlier, if your gear is not up to snuff in terms of mana recovery, then an Enduring Mana flask might be a necessity. Personally, I find the Dying Sun the easiest to swap out, as the others are all defensively critical. Optional here as well is a Cinder Swallow Urn, which could take the place of the Dying Sun or the Rumis, but I get massive FPS drops when I use it, so I didn't bother. Jewels play a critical role in the build as well. The most important core jewels will be quite familiar to anyone who remembers the Indigon days of yore, or who has played any other Archmage builds. Fevered Mind. The one thing I hesitated not to call core in the build, these jewels are incredibly powerful for scaling mana cost, and thus damage. They are a large part of the reason why the build is capable of the DPS output that it has, particularly while maintaining the core of defense that it can. Corrupt any and all Cobalt jewels you can get your hands on that are not rather well rolled, and eventually you'll get a couple. The build as I have it works with 3, but that can be difficult to sustain if the rest of your gear is a bit lacking in mana regen. 2 Fevered Minds is perfectly acceptable and will be able to work fine for reaching and clearing endgame. There are other unique jewels in the build as well, though, and they are certainly worth mentioning. A large Thread of Hope socketed into the jewel socket directly above Devotion allows the build to allocate Spiritual Aid the entirety of the Discipline Training Cluster and Righteous Decree, saves 5 or 6 passive points in the process of doing so. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side of the tree, Intuitive Leap is used to access life, mana, and charge generation in the jewel socket next to Pain Attunement. Finally, at the top of the tree, the build does make use of a couple of cluster jewels. A large 8-point lightning damage wheel is used to roll Scintillating Idea, Snowstorm, and Doriani's Lesson, though any of those but Scintillating Idea could just as easily have been Disorienting Display. 2 jewel sockets are also critical to have here, so an item level 75 jewel minimum is required. Branching off from this are 2 Area of Effect jewels, using Intensity and Towering Presence to scale life a bit further and pick up an additional couple stacks of Intensify, something we'll touch on again later. Leading off of one of these is a unique cluster jewel, Kitava's Teachings, which grants additional life and mana sustain through corpse consumption. Finally, a Watcher's Eye is socketed, which grants 10% of damage taken from mana before life while affected by Clarity. There will be a version of the tree available that does not use any of these clusters, except Kitava's Teachings, in order that a budget build version of the build will be more accessible. With itemization covered, let's move on to the links. The main link setup is of course our Cremation links, which differ slightly based on the state of gear that you're in. If you've opted for a Shroud of the Lightless, then your link setup will be Cremation, Controlled Destruction, Greater Multiple Projectiles, Archmage, and Intensify. If you've not gotten the cluster jewels with intensity notables, then Lightning Pen will be a better link than Intensify, and if you're missing Algar Mortis, then feel free to swap Controlled Destruction for Elemental Focus. If you've gone for something other than Shroud, then you'll use Lightning Pen as your 6th link. Archmage accounts for more than 90% of our damage, and is obviously lightning damage, so despite Cremation being a fire skill, Lightning Pen is the much better link over fire. That said, if you're not using Algar Mortis and thus don't care about the sap, feel free to use Elemental Focus. For mobility, I use both Shield Charge and a Flame Dash for access to Fortify as well as convenience in getting over or down ledges. The Shield Charge ought to be linked to faster attacks and Fortify, but the Flame Dash doesn't need any links. In our trigger weapon, as mentioned earlier, goes a few of our utility gems that we want consistent uptime on for various reasons. Bone Offering is the most important of these, which provides a pretty comfy pile of block. Alongside it is a Cold Snap to enable the full benefits of Algar Mortis, and a Wave of Conviction to shred boss resistances. Keeping the Wave of Conviction at a low level is important, as we don't get any conversion in the build, so we rely on adding Flat Lightning to the spell in order to get it to hit harder with lightning than any other element. To that end, try to avoid Flat Fire or Flat Cold dispels on your gear if possible to make this job easier. Other utility links include a 1-socket Tempest Shield, a Clarity at level 20, and a Precision at level 1. Precision gives us slightly more consistent Elemental Overload uptime at a very minimal mana cost, and Clarity activates our Watcher's Eye while also being quite helpful for recovering the buckets of mana that we spend every second. Arcane Cloak is also quite important, both offensively and defensively, and Desecrate is used for corpse generation. Linked to faster casting, Arcane Surge, and Spell Cascade. With multiple Fevered Minds, you can even use a level 20 Arcane Surge on your Desecrate and still have very consistent uptime. Until you have these fevered minds, I would suggest linking Arcane Surge instead to Arcane Cloak, as it natively spends quite a bit more mana than Desecrate will. The final 4-link in the build is taken up with a Vol Detonate Dead. Archmage, interestingly, will give a mana cost to Vol skills, and therefore will also give them the massive ton of lightning damage that comes along with it. Vol Detonate Dead has such good scaling with added damage, and good base damage itself, that even just in a 4-link it will often chunk endgame bosses quite hard. You could alternatively use a Vol Righteous Fire for extra burst, but I prefer this setup as it doesn't damage myself at all in the process of using it, while providing fairly similar extra damage. Also, Vol Detonate Dead is kinda cool. Your links here will be Vol Detonate Dead, Archmage, Elemental Focus, and Lightning Penetration. As far as the passive tree is concerned, there will be a number of trees to look through listed in the description below. Due to the fact that this build invests heavily into the endgame in various passive tree altering jewels, there will be a number of different trees for differing stages of budget and investment. Feel free to ask me any questions you may have regarding them. That should about cover it, though. Thank you for watching the guide, and like I just mentioned, in regards to the passive tree, feel free to ask whatever questions you might have below in regards to anything else in the build. If you want to get in touch anywhere else, my Twitter and Twitch will both be listed in the description below as well, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Thank you for watching, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or night.